Whatever's been making the noise is heard primarily at night. Some say it's a dog, but others say that's impossible. John Bindernagel makes his way into a forested area on Cormorant Island, looking for a creature many say doesn't exist.
It comes back to this question that comes up in other places. Not why is it here, how could it be here, but there is evidence that it is here. Well,
the wildlife biologist is one of North America's best-known Sasquatch researchers. He's here because many on the island in the community of Alert Bay are seeing and hearing something they can't explain.
Vocalizations which we really can't attribute to wolves, coyotes, loons, owls. So it's in that area of possible Sasquatch. I think it's more conceivable than people think, and more conceivable than I used to think, that a Sasquatch could be here, could only be being observed once every several years, a fleeting glimpse, but which is leaving, well, I'm calling it a record of its presence.
That record, Bindernagel says, includes large footprints that have sometimes been photographed in different locations around the island. The creature has also been acknowledged in the First Nations culture for years as Zunaqua. He knows there are many skeptics, but he's confident one day the mystery will be solved. Gord Kervis, CTV News, Alert Bay.
Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree, and I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
We don't like to be reminded just how similar the great apes are to us. We like the idea of a nice wide gap there between humans and other mammals of all sorts. It's not a matter of belief or faith in something here. It's a matter of having scrutinized the evidence and found it adequate, and realizing that others are unaware of a lot of this evidence, of most of this evidence. Our problem is to attract scientific colleagues to scrutinize that evidence. It's not that scientists are out there looking for it and can't find it. Scientists are looking the other way. It's not the Sasquatch which has eluded scientists, but scientists which have chosen to elude the Sasquatch. They don't want to hear about it. When we talk about the Sasquatch as just another North American mammal, you know, I always think of my work doing wildlife surveys, especially mammal surveys, where we are able to determine the presence of a mammal in an area on the basis of its tracks. Mammals aren't like birds. They're not so easily seen. They're elusive. They're often nocturnal. So we look for sign. We look for tracks. We look for scat. We look for feeding sign. On the basis of seeing bear tracks, we say, yes, there are black bears in this area or grizzly bears. And so this is same with the Sasquatch. This is an original. This is the best cast, actually, that my wife and I were able to make here on Vancouver Island. Unfortunately, between the time we found them and the time we got back with plaster, a hiker had stepped in it, so there's a bit of a boot print there. But other than that, it's just an awfully good cast, showing the large heel and the 5 toes. Here are a couple of casts of an immature Sasquatch from Washington State. And people often say, well, gee, if you got a young Sasquatch, the track would look like a human track, wouldn't it? Well, they don't, actually. One of the things quite common in Sasquatch tracks is the spreading of the toes. The Sasquatch foot seems to be, well, is much more flexible than the human foot, which is quite rigid by comparison. It's almost like the human hand, and then the toes quite commonly spread out like that. This is the largest cast in my collection. It's noteworthy for that point of view. It's also noteworthy because the big toe, the great toe, is quite divergent, sticking off to the side, which is very much an ape characteristic. Of course, in the great apes, the big toe is often straight out. In the Sasquatch, the big toe often diverges somewhat, and that's quite unhuman-like.
That's a gigantic cast.
It's a very large track. There's a bit of slide in here. I'm sure that the heel actually started about there. But yes, yeah, this This is an interesting cast because it shows another characteristic of the Sasquatch foot, and just as is shown in these young ones, and that is it is proportionately broader than the human foot. From eyewitness descriptions of the Sasquatch, it's very, very ape-like. Most of the anatomical features are ape-like. What is human-like is that bipedal gait, walking on 2 feet like humans, the foot shape with the big toe lined up alongside the others, very human-like looking foot. As we get into the great ape literature deeply, we find that no, that's not actually all that human-like. In the gorilla foot, the big toe can also line up with the other toes, and gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans do walk on 2 feet from time to time. So I think we'll find out that it's an ape. We don't like to be reminded just how similar the great apes are to us. We like the idea of a nice wide gap there between humans and other mammals of all sorts. And I think that's one of the problems with the Sasquatch. It's disturbing and upsetting because it does look so human-like. Because scientists have chosen not to study the Sasquatch, dedicated amateurs have come along and kind of filled that vacuum and taken it on. And most of them are doing a very good job. They're not always as well trained or as disciplined as they could be. On the other hand, it's not their job. I think if my biologist colleagues ever actually decided to get involved here, we'd move ahead really quickly. People say that's proven to be a hoax, right? Well, no, it hasn't been proven, but that's the perception out there. So I don't raise that film anymore, and it's very sad, but raising it as evidence just gets you into a discussion about he says, she says, and claims and counterclaims. I think we should just put that film aside for now, get on with the really hard evidence, especially the tracks, and then one day that we can bring that film back and say, well, what we now know about the Sasquatch is there in that film. My biologist colleague just loved to discover the presence of a new animal, a new small mammal or a new bird in an area. I mean, we sort of thrive on that. Now here we have something, but this is too big a discovery. I actually had a professional colleague at a university say this to me one time. He said, but John, if this thing existed, it would be the zoological discovery of the century. And he kind of left it hanging as if to say, and of course that can't be, can it? My experience from talking to hunters is that those hunters who have had a Sasquatch in their crosshairs, in the gun sights, have not been able to pull the trigger. They've seen an animal. First of all, it's not what they're hunting. It's not a moose, it's not a deer, it's not a bear. Second, it is very human-like. Apes are very human-like, and they're not about to kill one. I have the confidence that we'll look back and say, my goodness, now we see the discovery was unfolding. Maybe not quite as it should, but, you know, a certain amount of this resistance was just normal, natural, scientific resistance.
Native people know so much. It is passed on in oral history in the context of myth and legend. And non-native people have tended to dismiss myth and legend as sometimes even fictitious, made up, imagined, not factual in nature. And we need to scrutinize myth and legend more carefully. Again and again, what they've described is being described by pioneers and settlers, maybe only 100 years ago, and now, you know, even almost like, as I say, almost every week, there's an observation and someone describes it and says, but it's always such a shock. So these two casts, my wife Joan and I made these in 1987 in Strathcona Provincial Park. We were on a hike and saw the tracks, came back and cast them. Very nice casts, as you can see. These three were cast by a deer hunter up near Sayward on the east coast of Vancouver Island. Very, very nice cast. Here are these two juveniles showing the spread toes. Every person who sees a Sasquatch and says, oh my goodness, you know, they're essentially discovering this mammal for themselves, unaware that it's been discovered over and over and over by individuals and by cultures. We humans, I don't know how to say this, I think we have a tendency towards arrogance. Maybe that's a fair statement, in that, you know, we do insist on a very wide gulf between humans and other animals. And maybe that gulf shouldn't be treated quite as wide as we treat it, especially when it comes to primates. Now, we in North America don't really think about wild primates. You know, in Africa, of course, you know, people coexist alongside gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos. Well, we have the Sasquatch here as a very evolved primate. Well, I will say living alongside us, yeah, more or less. Maybe distantly, maybe not very often in contact or being observed, but here nevertheless. Hear a Sasquatch being described for me, there's certain things I'm looking for.
Every year, there are dozens of documented Bigfoot sightings in North America. Dr. John Bindernagel is a respected wildlife biologist and former advisor to the United Nations. After spending the last decade examining the evidence, he has come to one startling conclusion.
I accept the Sasquatch as an existing North American mammal. The long arms, and certainly the flat face, lacking the prominent snout of the bear. There'll often be deep-set eyes, brow ridges maybe. The flat nose, often with outward-facing nostrils, thin lips, ears almost always covered with hair, broad-shouldered.
Although Dr. Bindernagel has recorded nearly 200 eyewitness accounts, there are more than 2,000 known reports from across North America. The greatest concentration of sightings are from the coastlines and mountainous interiors of the northwestern United States and Canada.
To me, it's very interesting. People encounter Sasquatches, if not on a weekly basis in North America, every month. What he's described really does fit, you know, both behavior and anatomy of an upright great ape. This description adds up to a real animal. Only 2 months ago, a couple who were fishing in a remote part of this same watershed were woken up at 5:30 in the morning when something was throwing large rocks into the river. And they were pretty spooked because they were really out there by themselves. They probably won't tent there again. That was likely a Sasquatch. So the projectile throwing, the throwing of large, heavy projectile, is unique to the Sasquatch. We're talking about an animal with superhuman strength. Most eyewitnesses are not looking for notoriety. They don't believe that Sasquatches exist. They've had basically the misfortune of seeing one, and they're having to come to terms with it.
But Dr. John Bindernagel disagrees. The numerous eyewitness accounts he's recorded usually involve people who are far from seeking attention.
It's somewhere between 100 and 200 people that I have actually talked to about their eyewitness account. I'm hearing them say, I don't want my name used. I'm hearing them say, you know, I had to go to bed with all the lights on in the house because I was so scared. This element of distress that comes with seeing an animal that's not supposed to exist.
Since his research began a decade ago, Dr. John Bindernagel is drawn to those who claim to have had Bigfoot encounters.
For me, the most compelling evidence is actually a combination of the eyewitness reports and the tracks which corroborate them.